Hi everyone, welcome to Curious Minds Academy. In the last session, we have conducted the revision of Chapter 1 Business Ethics. In this session, we will be conducting the revision of Chapter 2, that is Ethics for Management Accountants. In the next 10 to 15 minutes, we will be covering the entire Ethics for Management Accountants portion. And the reason for providing these revision videos is to make your life easy. The number one purpose is after going through the entire concepts, before attempting practice questions, it is advisable to watch this revision video so that before going into the practice session, you can brush through your concepts once again, and that too in a quick way. The second purpose is as and when the examination comes, you don't have time to go through all the lectures, right? So you just need to come and visit these revision lectures to fresh up your concepts. So this is the purpose of providing this revision video. So without wasting any time, let's get into the revision of Ethics for Management Accountants. The first concept that we have learned in Ethics for Management Accountants is the four overarching principles. IMA's four overarching principles, which have been mentioned in IMA's statement of ethical professional practice. And what are those four principles? Those four principles are honesty, fairness, objectivity, and responsibility. And let's see what each means. The first principle is honesty. Honesty principle means that one should be honest in performing their job responsibilities. Freedom from fraud, freedom from deceit is what honesty principle implies. While performing job responsibilities, one should not commit any fraud. One should be honest and truthful towards the executing their job responsibilities, and that's what honesty principle mean. And after covering honesty principle, now let's move on to the second principle, that is fairness principle. And what do fairness principle implies? Fairness means being impartial, being free from bias. Imagine that you are the manager of your organization, and in the same organization your best friend is also working. Being a fair manager, being an impartial manager, you shall not allow your best friend to log in late and log out early. So you should be impartial, you should be fair to each and everyone in the organization. You shall not be partial to your best friend, or you shall be partial to anyone. You shall be impartial, you shall be fair in performing your job responsibilities, and that's what fairness principle means. And after covering fairness principle, let's move on to the third principle, and that is objectivity. Objectivity simply means that basing your decision on the basis of facts alone. You shall not take decision on the basis of your emotions. It's not like if you are happy, then you shall say yes to everything. If you are angry or sad, you shall say no to everything. Basing decision on established set of criteria or on the basis of facts given to you is what objectivity implies. And after moving from objectivity, then we come on to the last and the fourth principle, and that is called responsibility. Getting the job done in a timely way, in a correct way, is what responsibility implies. And responsibility also implies one more thing: taking accountability or taking responsibility for one's own job. And this is what job responsibility implies. Let's take a scenario. Imagine that you are the finance manager of your organization, and it is your responsibility to prepare the financial statements. You shall prepare the financial statements in a correct way, in a time-bound way. So if anything goes wrong in that financial statements, then it shall be your responsibility. You shall take accountability for that. So revising it for you, there are four principles which has been mentioned by the IMA in its statement of ethical professional practice. Those four principles are honesty, fairness, objectivity, and responsibility. Now please don't get confused these principles with the standards given by IMA. For ease of remembering the principles, I have given you that example. Remember that scenario, the courtroom scenario, where there are four characters. The four characters were the accused, the advocate of the accused, the police, and the fourth character was the judge. And how can we connect this scenario to the four principles? Let's see that. The accused need to confess his crime. He need to be honest whether he has done the crime or not. So there goes the honesty principle. The advocate of the accused has the responsibility to get him bail. He has the responsibility of whether he gets a bail or whether the judge sets him free or whether accused gets imprisonment, right? So he alone has the responsibility for the future life of the accused. So there goes the responsibility principle. And the police should conduct the investigation in a fair way, in an impartial way. The police should not have the prejudice like this guy has committed the crime. The investigation should be done in a fair way. The investigation should be done in a impartial way, should be free from bias. And there goes the fairness principle. And the judge, he need to base his decision on the basis of facts provided to him and not on the basis of emotions. And there goes the objectivity principle. So remember this scenario when you are asked about the IMA's 4 overarching principles. Remember the scenario and connect the characters with the principles, and that will help you to distinguish the principles from the standards. And after discussing the principles, now let's move on to the standards part. And what are the 4 standards that has been prescribed by the IMA in its statement of ethical professional practice? There is 3C and 1I: competence, confidentiality, credibility, and the 1I is integrity. In order to correctly identify what all points do these standards contain, we need to ask questions to ourselves. The first standard is competence. In order to improve competence, we should improve our professional knowledge and skill, right? And after improving our professional knowledge and skill, are we sitting idle? No, we need to perform our job responsibilities. We need to perform our jobs in accordance with the rules, in accordance with the regulations, in accordance with the technical standards. Okay, and after performing these job responsibilities, then we gain expertise on it. And after gaining expertise, then we need to provide recommendations to the management. So remember, if the standard competence is asked, ask yourself question: how can we improve our competence? The first thing, we should improve our professional knowledge and skill. And after improving our professional knowledge and skill, are we sitting idle? No, we need to perform our job responsibilities in accordance with the rules, regulations, and technical standards. And if we perform that on a continuous basis, we become expert in that, and expert people do give recommendations, right, to the management. After gaining expertise on your job responsibilities, then you need to provide recommendations to the management, and that will enable them to take decision on the basis of that. And that is what do you mean by the standard competence. And after competence standard, there comes the second standard, that is confidentiality. We need to keep the organization's data confidential. The organization data should not fall into the wrong hands. So the organization data should be kept confidential. And yes, the confidentiality can be breached under 2 conditions. If the management themselves authorize to disclose that data, then you can disclose it. And the second condition, if it is required by law, if the data has been asked by any statutory authorities like tax authorities, then you can disclose that. There is nothing wrong in that. That is called confidentiality standard. And to ensure confidentiality, what can you do? On your part and on the other's part. On your part, you need to refrain from gaining any advantage by using that confidential data. You may be having tons of confidential data with you, and you shall not take any advantage from using that confidential data. And what about the others? And how can we ensure the others are also maintaining confidentiality? We need to monitor them. First, we need to make aware of them that the confidentiality standard is expected of them, and then we need to monitor them. So monitoring ethical compliance is what is also required under confidentiality standard. So what do you mean by confidentiality standard? Confidentiality simply means preventing the organization's data falling into the wrong hands. So we need to maintain confidentiality, and we need to maintain confidentiality on our part as well as the others' part also. On our part, we should not gain any advantage by using that confidential data. On the others' part, we should educate them regarding the confidentiality standard, and then we need to monitor them. And yes, the confidentiality standard can be breached under 2 conditions. And what are the 2 conditions? The 2 conditions are if it is required by the law and if it is authorized by the management. management themselves. So under these two conditions only, you can disclose the confidential data. After discussing competence, after discussing confidentiality, the third C that comes is credibility. We often say that the forwarded messages that we are receiving in these WhatsApp, in these Facebook are not credible, right? We often uses the term credible when it comes to these forwarded messages. We often say that these messages are not credible. So what does this credibility mean? It means that the information that these forwarded messages contain are not complete, are not accurate, are not reliable also. So when we have to ensure credibility, then we need to provide information that has completeness, that has accuracy in it, that has reliability in it. So we need to provide complete, accurate and reliable information to ensure credibility in our work. So whenever the management asks you any information, you need to provide complete information. You need to provide information fairly and objectively. You should not beat around the bush. It should be based on the facts. Okay, you should be objective. Remember the objective that we have discussed in the principles section. It should be based on the facts. So you should communicate the information fairly and objectively. When you are providing information, it may not be 100%. You may have experienced certain limitations. It may contain, the information that you are providing contain some deficiencies, may contain some deficiencies also, right? So in that cases, you need to provide the details regarding that deficiencies. What all deficiencies are there in the information that you are providing? What all limitations have you experienced in providing the information? So it needs to be a complete picture. So in order to have credibility in you while you provide information, you need to provide first complete information. The information should be presented fairly and objectively. Third, if any deficiency is there in that information, then you need to disclose that deficiency. You need not conceal that deficiency. You should openly disclose that deficiency. And the fourth one, if you have experienced any limitation in providing that information, then you need to disclose that information also. So deficiency, limitation, anything and everything should be openly and properly communicated to the management. So this is what the standard of credibility means. After covering 3C, we are coming on to the 1I, and that 1I is called integrity. And what do you mean by integrity? Integrity means mitigating the conflict of interest. Integrity, there is I, conflict of interest, interest there is I, so you can match the two I's, and that is integrity with the interest. So integrity means mitigating the conflict of interest, minimizing the conflict of interest. Conflict of interest between what all interest? Your personal interest and your professional interest. And how can we mitigate? Refrain from engaging in any activity that might derail from your job responsibilities. Refrain from engaging in any activity that might discredit your profession itself. The first was job responsibilities, the second is profession. So integrity means mitigating the conflict of interest. And how can we mitigate the conflict of interest? By refraining from any activity, not engaging in any unwanted activity, refraining from any activity that might derail you from your job responsibilities, refraining from any activity that might discredit your profession. And by doing all of this, you are promoting an ethical, positive work culture. So this is what the standard of integrity mean. So summarizing it for you, the principles include honesty, fairness, objectivity and responsibility. Remember the court scenario. And the standards include 3C and 1I, competence, confidentiality, credibility, and the 1I is integrity. So this is what the 4 overarching principles of IMA means, and here this is what the standards of IMA means. Now let's move on to the concept of resolving ethical issues. Now, if you are working in an organization and you happen to see an ethical fraud happening in that organization, what all steps can you take to resolve that ethical issue? Now, let's say you are working in an organization and you happen to see the accountant in that organization is committing an ethical fraud. The first step is look if there is any policies that exist in the organization to handle these kind of issues. If there are policies that exist in the organization, then you need to follow those policies first as the first step. And if there are no policies in the organization, The second step is to inform the manager of that accountant that such and such ethical fraud is being done by the accountant. So you need to look into it. You can inform the accountant's manager. Let's assume that the manager is also involved in that fraud. Then you need to move on to the next level of management to inform about the ethical fraud. Suppose if the entire management is corrupt, then what you need to do, you need to consult with an attorney to discuss the legal implication. What all legalities are involved in this matter, you need to consult with an attorney. And suppose if the attorney also is not able to provide you any solution to this problem, then you need to consider disassociating with the organization. You need to resign from the position. So you need to disassociate from the organization. So the first step is follow the organization's policies, and if there are no organization's policies, then you need to inform the supervisor of that particular employee. If the supervisor is also corrupt, then you need to move on to the next level of management. If the entire management is corrupt, then you need to consult with the attorney to discuss the legal implications. And if the legal attorney is also helpless, is not able to provide you any solution, then disassociate with the organization. And these are the steps that you can follow to resolve ethical issues in your organization. The next topic that we are going to discuss is types of fraud. The two types of fraud are fraudulent financial reporting and misappropriation of asset. Fraudulent financial reporting means falsifying the financial statements. Suppose if the sales are only $100,000, if we are making it $500,000, then that is called fraudulent financial reporting. Falsifying the financial statement is what is meant by fraudulent financial reporting. And the second type of fraud is misappropriation of asset. Using the asset for other than company's use, for other than its intended use. Let's say stealing of asset, using the company's assets for personal use, all comes under the misappropriation of assets. So these are the two types of fraud that comes under the types of fraud topic. And then after types of fraud, then we move on to the fraud triangle. And what do you mean by fraud triangle? Fraud triangle specifies that if the three conditions mentioned in the fraud triangle, that is pressure, rationalization, opportunity, are present in an organization, then the risk of happening of the fraud is more in that organization. It doesn't say that if these three conditions are present, then the fraud will 100% happen there. It doesn't say that. It only says that the risk of happening of the fraud will be more in that organization. And what are the three conditions? Pressure, rationalization, and opportunity. Opportunity, if someone finds an opportunity to commit a fraud, let's say if the internal control of that organization is weak, then the risk of happening of the fraud is more in that organization. Rationalization, if a fraudulent employee decides to commit a fraud, he justifies himself, he justifies his action. It's okay to commit fraud. Remember that cashier example, I am only borrowing the money, I will put it back when I receive my salary. I'm only borrowing my money to pay off my EMIs. When I get my salary, I will put it back in the cash box. And that is what the cashier thinks. And this is an example of rationalization. He justifies himself, he justifies his action, he tells himself that it is okay to commit this fraud. And the last condition is pressure. If he is under constant financial pressure, let's say he has to pay off his EMIs, so he's under constant pressure to commit some fraud to pay off the EMI, to commit some financial fraud. So that is an example of the condition pressure. So these are the three conditions that the fraud triangle states. First one is pressure, rationalization, and the third one is opportunity. And after discussing fraud triangle, then we move on to the next topic, managing the risk of fraud. How can the management manage the risk of fraud? The management can employ some controls in the organization, more relevantly known as internal controls. Internal controls are those controls that the management can place in an organization to ensure that everything happens in a smooth way. Establishment of controls is the first way how the management can manage the risk of fraud. In the establishment of controls, there are several controls that we have discussed. The first one is preventive control. Preventive controls prevents the happening of an unwanted event. Directive controls guides to the happening of a certain event. Detective controls detect the happening of a certain event. So just by the name of it, you can identify what all controls does what all jobs. So preventive controls, directive controls, detective controls, compensatory controls are some of the controls that the management can employ in managing the risk of fraud in an organization. So after establishment of controls, there comes segregation of duties. What all comes under segregation of duties? What all duties need to be segregated? Asset custody, record keeping, authorization. These are the three functions that need to be done by separate individuals. Let's take the example of the asset cash, the custody of the cash, the record keeping of the cash. Authorization of cash vouchers cannot be done by the same individuals. Those three functions need to be done by the separate individuals. Otherwise, the risk of happening of the fraud will be more. So this is another control that the management can place in an organization to manage the risk of fraud. The third one is independent checks and verification. The assets actual balance should be compared with the balance as per the books, so that if there is any variance, it can be identified and such variance can be inquired into. So if we are conducting the physical inspection of cash, the cash actual balance should be compared with the balance as per the cash book, and this inspection should not be done by the cashier himself. It has to be someone independent. It has to be someone either from the management or independent from the cashier. So this is what independent checks and verification means. So let's revise the technique that we can have in our mind to remember these things. Committing the fraud is a pro level job. PRO level job, that is pressure rationalization opportunity. So committing the fraud is a pro level job and managing the risk of fraud is an EC level job. EC level job means ESI, that is EC level job. Managing the risk of fraud is an EC level job. E for establishment of controls, S for segregation of duties, I for independent checks and verification. So committing a fraud is a pro level job and managing the risk of fraud is an EC job. So this is how you can quickly remember these things. So I think that's all from the chapter of ethics for management accountants. In the next revision session, we will be dealing with ethics for organization, wherein we will be dealing with FCPA, UKBA, all that stuff. So that's it from this revision session. Happy learning. Thank you so much.